and we are going through Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, having recently finished the discourse on method. And I just failed to record a video introducing the preface to the reader here in the Hackett edition of these two books, and this is specifically the preface to the reader of the Meditations on First Philosophy, not to the discourse. And this preface will explain how the Meditations is a sequel to the discourse. But I got confused by Descartes' own confusing language, and I have to restart. So I also have to go fast. I have class in not very many minutes. 22 minutes. Okay, so I got to keep this brief as much as I possibly can. So the Discourse on Method was the first book, and it was broader in scope. It was, he specifically says, meant to be a book for more people to read. It was a book for the general audience, the general public, a broader audience. The Meditations on First Philosophy is meant more for professional philosopher-theologian types, for people who have been properly trained in this hardcore philosophy, metaphysics stuff. And it's not so much for a general audience. So he wrote the general audience book, which briefly did some serious philosophy in Part 4 and Part 5 in particular. And now he's writing the Meditations on First Philosophy, the sequel to the general book, the discourse being the general book, the Meditations being the sequel. And the sequel zooms in on that metaphysics, epistemology stuff, and will do, well, nothing but, perhaps oversimplifying a bit, a really detailed look at the metaphysics and epistemology stuff from Parts 4 and 5 of the discourse. So there was the Discourse on Method, and now we're doing the Meditations, the sequel, and we're doing the preface to the reader of the Meditations that identifies this book as a sequel and explains how it's going to go into more detail, particularly for a more highly trained philosophical theologian type audience, for an audience of more highly trained theologian, philosopher type readers. Now he mentions one other text, and it is not included in this Hackett edition, though I believe I read it on a Kindle app on my other phone over there. Well, who knows which phone I read it on, but the Kindle app is on the other phone over there, and I read it on some phone or other. This third text would be the objections and replies. So he mentions the objections and replies here. After writing the discourse, and after writing the Meditations, but before publishing the Meditations, he had sent the Meditations to certain scholars, asking them to look over it and give it their response, give it their critiques. And they did. And so he wrote up the objections with his replies to the objections, and the objections and replies was included with the first edition of the Meditations. So in the original version, you were supposed to have read the discourse somewhere else, and then you read the Meditations, and then at the back of the Meditations, you read the objections and replies. However, in this nifty Hackett edition, while we do have the discourse and the Meditations, we don't have the objections and replies. But you can find them elsewhere, and if my brain holds up, maybe I should look into doing a video on them specifically. All right, so what else do I need to say about the preface? I think I want to mention probably only, 6 things or so. It's only about 7 paragraphs. So Descartes, at the end of the preface, earnestly entreats readers not to form a judgment regarding the Meditations until they bother to read the whole book and the objections and replies. So there you go. Descartes asking you, don't diss this book. The Meditations on First Philosophy. Don't say there's something wrong with the philosophy here till you've read the objections and replies to make sure. And I say, it's probably a pretty good idea, but, maybe you can form some provisional judgments and then read the objections and replies. At any rate, it would be better to read the objections and replies. I think you will probably still find there are significant flaws that can be identified even after consulting his replies to the objections. Anyway, all that can come later, God willing. What is terribly important in the Meditations? I know, in the preface to the Meditations. I know what is the last thing I want to say about it. Let's go to the first brief things, and then the main middle things, and then the brief last thing. The first things are the first 2 paragraphs where he says, I've already touched briefly on the issues of God and the human mind in my discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and searching for truth in the sciences, published in French in 1637. In other words, this book's the sequel. And God and the soul were the crucial focus, let's make it plural, foci, of the Discourse on Method. And now he's going to zoom in on the reflections on God and the soul in this book, where he's going to give a more precise treatment of the topic. And in the discourse, he asked everyone to respond and, if necessary, if it helps, refute him. And he's noticed 2 objections of particular interest, and he's going to make a point of handling those objections properly in the meditations, but he does give us a brief 1-paragraph preview on each of these objections. So now I want to go over those paragraphs a bit, and then I want to make one quick observation on something else that's really important in the preface, and then I'll shut up for this week, and I need to go to class also. The first of these 2 objections is that from the fact that the human mind, when turned in on itself, does not perceive itself to be anything other than a thinking thing, it does not follow that its nature or essence consists only in its being a thinking thing, such that the word only excludes everything else that also could be said to belong to the nature of the soul. So there's a particular passage in part 4 of the discourse that we talked about, where Descartes talks about how he reasons, I think, therefore I am, and etc., and hey, look at that. I can find out what I am too, by observing that I think, therefore I am. I can find out what I am as a thinking thing. So, as I probably explained in an earlier video, it looks to me like there's something... no, sorry, I'm mixing up my responses, my objections, and his responses to my objections. He's anticipated my response to at least one of his objections here. So I'm not going to say at this time, probably, whether he did a good job responding to my objection. I didn't really have an objection here that I can recall. I just had a tentative explanation of the argument. So, getting ahead of myself and getting mixed up. Sorry. Discourse on Method, Part 4. He talks about how I think, therefore I am, and I can also figure out what I am by the fact that I'm thinking. I'm thinking, and therefore I am a thinking thing. And I am only a thinking thing. Why? Because, as I tried to explain, because everything I can imagine that might be an aspect of my personal identity is something I can imagine myself existing without. Everything I can think that might be part of what I am, like being male, or having a body, having a brain, having a body at all, or being in space, maybe even being in time, and, I don't know, being son of Paul and Carol Boone, or having hair of this color, or being so many years old, or being a human being at all. All of these things are things I can imagine myself existing without, because I can imagine myself being just a mind being deceived by the evil demon of those thought experiments from Part 4 of the Discourse. So his argument was something like that. Take anything you can imagine might be part of what a human being is, and you find you can doubt all of them. You can imagine yourself existing without those things, so those things are not essential to who you are. What is essential? Only thinking. Because you can't imagine yourself existing without thinking. If what you think is you existed without thinking, it wouldn't be you. It would be something else. And the only way you know you do exist is, I think, therefore I am. So basically something like that was the extended argument I tried to articulate. Now Descartes says here that some of his critics had looked at this argument and said that it doesn't follow. It doesn't follow from the observation, I think, therefore I am, that all I am is a thinking thing. Descartes says, I did not intend my exclusion of those things to reflect the order of the truth of the matter. I wasn't dealing with it then, but merely the order of my perception. Thus, what I had in mind was that I was aware of absolutely nothing that I knew belonged to my essence, save that I was a thinking thing, that is, a thing having within itself the faculty of thinking. In other words, Descartes says, at the time in the Discourse on Method, I was not arguing that I am necessarily only a thinking thing. I'm just describing, or I was just describing at the time, that this is the only thing I'm sure I am. So maybe I was getting ahead of the argument, but I think we'll find that's probably his argument in any case. And he says here, later on, however, i.e. in this book, the sequel book, The Meditations, coming up soon, I will show how it follows from the fact that I know of nothing else belonging to my essence, that nothing else really does belong to it. And that's all I should say about that. We should wait and see what he says and see if he gives the same account of the argument I've been giving. Now, this next one is going to be more difficult, which means if I'm prudent, I may be able to say much less about it. He says, the second objection is that it does not follow from the fact that I have within me an idea of a thing more perfect than me, that this idea is itself more perfect than me, and still less that what is represented by this idea exists. So, let's pause and comment on that. Descartes had given an argument that God exists, based on his idea of a perfect being. I think, therefore I am. I exist, I'm a thinking thing, and I observe within my mind the idea of a perfect being. Well, that tells me that a perfect being actually does exist, and therefore God exists, because an effect cannot be greater than its cause, rather vice versa. Cause must be greater than its effect, so perfect being needs so the idea of a perfect being needs a perfect being to cause it, therefore God exists. And as I explained, the idea of a perfect being doesn't seem like it's a perfect thing. It's an idea of a perfect thing, but the idea itself might not be perfect. So why say God has to cause it? Maybe I could have caused it myself. Descartes had been reading that objection, and he says, "But I answer that there is an equivocation here in the word idea. For idea can be taken either materially, for an operation of the intellect, in which case it cannot be said to be more perfect than me, or objectively, for the thing represented by means of that operation." So I think what he's saying here is, when I make that objection, I'm equivocating. I'm making the mistake of talking about the idea in the mind, rather than the thing the idea is an idea of, which is what he was really talking about. So I think he's saying I misunderstood his argument. Okay, maybe. Let's hopefully keep an eye on it when he gets back to this, because he will in good time. But he's saying here, the word idea can refer to the idea in your mind, or the thing it's an idea of. And I think he's saying that his critics have taken it to refer to just the idea in the mind when he was talking about something else, which makes me wonder, what else was he talking about? How can he get to something else at this stage of the method of doubt? I don't really know. But maybe it'll turn up later. And if not, maybe we'll have cause to say provisionally, without reviewing the objections and replies in more detail, that we may still think Descartes' wrong on this point. That's probably where I'll be, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. He says, this thing, even if it is not presumed to exist outside the intellect, can nevertheless be more perfect than me by reason of its essence. So an idea can't be more perfect than me if idea just means the thing in my head, the thing in my mind. But if it means the thing my idea is of, the idea in my mind is an idea of, then it certainly can be more perfect than me, and such is the idea of God, and therefore it needs to be caused by something more perfect than me, etc., etc. Therefore God exists. I will explain in detail in the ensuing remarks, he says. I'll explain in more detail how, from the mere fact that there is within me an idea of something more perfect than me, it follows that this thing really exists, and I just better stop there. We better wait until we see his analysis of this in more detail. Now finally, he references some other things. And briefly, let me just observe that he talks about the objections typically bandied about by the atheists to assail the existence of God. And he says they tend to depend either on ascribing human emotions to God, or on arrogantly claiming for our mind such power and wisdom that we attempt to determine and grasp fully what God can and ought to do. Hence, these objections will cause us no difficulty, provided we but remember that our minds are to be regarded as finite, while God is to be regarded as incomprehensible and infinite. So basically he's talking about how some critics of the existence of God and of the soul as a non-physical thing, they make mistakes. Like the mistake made, I think, in The Problem of Evil, saying God ought to do such and such has not happened, which is bad, therefore God must not exist. And they're assuming Descartes says that they know far more of the mind of God and God's infinite wisdom than we, with our finite wisdom, are capable of knowing. And we'll stop there. The more detailed reflection on God and the soul is coming up soon, but there is a synopsis first. And I don't know, maybe I want to do a video on the synopsis. Maybe not. We shall see. See you then, in any case, whenever I see you, whatever is the next video. Thanks for watching.